Games have always been a huge part of modern entertainment. From Pong in the early 1970s to AAA massive open world games of today. Games have had a huge influence on most of our lives. The era which was best for video games and its influence have been heavily debated throughout recent history, but it's often at least acknowledged that the arcade game eras of the 80s and 90s were some of the best in terms of popularity. With huge games that are still regarded heavily even today, such as the Mario Brothers, Donkey Kong, and Sonic the Hedgehog, the so-called golden age of video games have held a lot of great times and memories for the people that play them. But today, we are going to look at what happens when an arcade game is attached to the not-so-good side of life. Berzerk was an arcade game created by Stern Electronics, released in 1980. You would spawn into a randomly generated maze-like room where you would have to navigate to the other side by maneuvering through and killing the enemies with a laser-style beam that could be controlled by a joystick. A relatively simple game if it wasn't for the two key details that made this game a little bit more special for the time. The first of which was the implementation of a voice synthesized generated prompts. Berzerk had a combined 5 randomly generated speech prompts, which was incredibly rare for an arcade game at the time, and is said to have cost the company $3,000 to implement. The second one is the implementation of the game's villain, Evil Otto. Evil Otto would, in the game's meta, be the one to control the enemies and give orders. He would spawn in your current stage after a while to get you to move on to the next stage quicker. If you were touched by Evil Otto, you would die. Evil Otto was also unkillable, making him a unique concept for the time. With this being said, and the fact that Berzerk was backed up as being one of the first shooter maze games that inspired many games to come, such as Robotron 2084 and Castle Wolfenstein, makes it obvious that Berzerk was a very popular game during the 1980s. On Saturday, April 3rd, 1982, the 18-year-old Peter Bukowski of South Holland, Illinois, woke up with a severe cold in his home. The weather forecast had predicted a heavy blizzard that day. However, despite this, Bukowski would travel for 2 miles from his South Holland home to Friar Truck's game room in Calumet City. According to witnesses, Bukowski would arrive at Friar Truck's game room at around 8 p.m. Bukowski's eyes immediately set sight on Berzerk, according to the owner of the game room, a man by the name of Tom Blankley, going on to state that Bukowski loved the game and would always be playing it when he was there. Peter Bukowski had also stopped at his friend's house on his path to Friar Truck's game room and reportedly stated that he had been feeling short of breath and extremely thirsty. He had reportedly stopped at a local convenience store, bought a soda, and drank it quickly before continuing it on his way to the game room. Upon arrival to the arcade, it was very clear to the other players that Bukowski, a regular, wasn't feeling himself and was visibly sluggish and tired. Despite this, however, he went ahead to play 2 games of Berzerk, both being high scores, before stepping away from the machine and collapsing on the ground. Peter Bukowski would tragically die upon arrival to the Indiana hospital. Jeff Daley was another teen obsessed with the game Berzerk. Living in Virginia, he would frequently visit his local arcade to play his favorite game. However, yet again, tragedy would strike on January 12th, 1981, as the 19-year-old Daley would go on to suffer a massive heart attack after playing the first game for more than 2 hours, with his final score being 16,660. Remove the first and last letters of the score, and you end up with 666. On a warm Monday, of March 20th, 1988, Edward Clark Jr., 17 years old, of Lansing, Illinois, would find himself at Friar Tuck's game room, the same room which Peter Bukowski had died at only 6 years earlier. Clark was a mischievous child who, while never having an experience with law enforcement in the past, he didn't like authority and had an attitude. Edward walked into Friar Tuck's game room and first played a few games of Battlezone before he stepped to the Berzerk machine, the very same one Peter Bukowski had died on. Clark had seen a few quarters on the machine that had seemingly been abandoned. He put in one of the quarters and started playing the game. Almost immediately, 16-year-old Pedro Roberts came over from a few machines away to confront Clark, stating that the quarters belonged to him. After refusing to step away from the machine, Roberts became restless and started a fight with one of Clark's friends, who was also at the arcade. After witnessing the fight that was breaking out, Clark came to his friend's aid, which only escalated the fight. An employee at the arcade separated the three, but was smart not to kick out all three at the same time, sensing that something more drastic would happen outside. He first kicked out Roberts, and 10 minutes later, Clark, but urged him not to go the same way of which Roberts went. Clark foolishly decided to ignore this advice, and was killed via stabbing in an alleyway that Roberts had waited for him in. So now that you've heard the story of Berzerk, you're probably thinking, there must be some kind of curse in this game or something, right? Well, here's where it gets interesting. Remember Jeff Daley? Well, he never actually existed. There are a lot of flaws in his story, such as no actual news reports ever being released about his death, and an extreme lack of information available on Google. Whilst the cases of Peter Bukowski and Edward Clark Jr. sure could have many conspiracy theorists ask what's going on, I personally think it's just a case that Clark was in the wrong place at the wrong time, whilst Peter Bukowski had a pre-existing heart problem, meaning that if the game didn't kill him, something else would. With all this being said, I want to know what you think. Is it simply a coincidence, or is there something more sketchy going on behind the scenes? And with that being said, sweet dreams, and until next time.